They say every legend has a shred of truth, but I never thought I'd find myself face to face with one of the most infamous tales of all time, La Llorona. Her name alone is enough to send chills down spines across generations, a weeping woman searching for her lost children, cursing anyone who dares to cross her path. I grew up hearing stories about her, like everyone else, but I never believed them. Not until this happened to me. It was supposed to be a simple trip, a few days away from the noise of the city, reconnecting with nature. My friends and I had planned a weekend camping trip near a quiet river in the southwestern United States. The area was remote, miles away from any town or cell service, but it was beautiful, untouched, and perfect for disconnecting from the world. When we arrived, the air was thick with the smell of pine and the faint murmur of the river winding through the valley. We set up our tents, laughing and joking, unaware that we were stepping into a story that would change everything I thought I knew about reality. The first sign came that evening, though none of us recognized it at the time. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the sky in deep purples and oranges, an eerie stillness settled over the forest. The usual sounds of the wilderness, the chirping of birds, the rustling of leaves, vanished. It was as if the forest was holding its breath. My friend Sarah was the first to speak up. "Do you guys feel that? Like, we're being watched?" We all laughed it off, chalking it up to the isolation. But even as I joined in the jokes, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The shadows seemed darker, the air colder, and the silence, it was oppressive. That night, as we sat around the campfire, the conversation inevitably turned to ghost stories. Someone brought up La Llorona, and we all laughed nervously as we shared the tales we'd heard growing up. Sarah, always the skeptic, rolled her eyes. "Come on," she said, "it's just a story. A way to keep kids from playing by the water at night. There's no such thing as ghosts." I wanted to agree with her, but as the fire crackled and the shadows danced around us, I felt an unease I couldn't explain. It was as if the very mention of her name had summoned something. Later that night, I woke to the sound of crying. It was faint at first, a soft, mournful wail that drifted through the still air. Groggy and disoriented, I sat up in my tent, straining to listen. The crying grew louder, more desperate, and I realized it was coming from the direction of the river. My heart pounded as I unzipped the tent and stepped outside. The moon cast an eerie glow over the campsite, and the river glistened like a ribbon of silver in the distance. "Hello?" I called out, my voice barely more than a whisper. No response. The crying continued, carrying with it a weight of sorrow that made my chest ache. Against my better judgment, I started walking toward the sound. The closer I got to the river, the colder the air became. It wasn't the natural chill of the night, but a bone-deep cold that seeped into my very soul. The crying grew louder, and I could hear words now, Spanish, though I couldn't make out what they were saying. And then I saw her. She was standing at the edge of the river, her back to me, dressed in a flowing white gown that seemed to glow in the moonlight. Her long, dark hair cascaded down her back, and her shoulders shook with sobs. "Are you okay?" I called out, my voice trembling. She froze. Slowly she turned to face me, and that's when I saw her face. Or rather, the lack of one. Her features were blurred, as if erased, but her eyes burned with a white-hot intensity that pierced through me. I stumbled back, my breath coming in ragged gasps. She reached out a hand, long and skeletal, and let out a scream so piercing it felt like my skull was splitting. I don't remember running back to the campsite. All I know is that I woke up in my tent the next morning, drenched in sweat and shaking. When I told my friends what had happened, they laughed it off, accusing me of having an overactive imagination. But I knew what I had seen, and the terror in my voice must have been convincing enough, because Sarah agreed to pack up and leave that afternoon. As we loaded up the car, I noticed something strange. The riverbank where I had seen the woman was completely dry. No water, no footprints, nothing. It was as if she had never been there. The drive back was tense, the laughter and excitement from the trip replaced with a heavy silence. But as we neared the city, I started to relax. The sunlight felt warm, reassuring, and I told myself that it was over. I couldn't have been more wrong. Over the next few days, strange things began to happen. I would wake in the middle of the night to the sound of crying, faint and distant, yet unmistakable. Objects in my apartment would move on their own, a chair pulled out from the table, a picture frame tilted on the wall. And then came the dreams. Night after night I dreamed of the river, of the woman in white. She would stand at the edge, her blurred face turned toward me, whispering words I couldn't understand. But the message was clear. I had crossed a line, and now I was cursed. When I told my family and friends about what I had seen at the river, I hoped they would understand, even believe me. Instead, I was met with skeptical smiles, nervous laughs, and condescending assurances that it was all just my imagination. Deep down, I wanted to believe them. I wanted to think it was just a bad dream, a trick of the mind, but the events that followed made it clear. La Llorona had chosen me, and there was no escape. The crying followed me everywhere. Day and night, faint and distant, like a shadow lurking just out of sight. At first, I thought it was in my head, some lingering trauma from the camping trip. But then others started hearing it too. One night Sarah came over. She hadn't visited since the trip, and her usual sharp skepticism was softened by a strange tension in her voice. "I can't sleep," she said, sinking into my couch. "I keep hearing things." "What things?" I asked, though I already knew. She hesitated, looking down at her hands. "Crying. A woman crying." My stomach dropped. She wasn't mocking me this time. She was scared. "It's her," I whispered, barely able to say the words. "La Llorona. She's not done with us." Sarah's face went pale. "That's ridiculous. It's just stress, that's all." But her trembling hands betrayed her words. That night, Sarah stayed over, insisting she didn't want to be alone. As we tried to distract ourselves with a movie, the crying started again. It was louder this time, echoing through the apartment like it was coming from the walls themselves. "Do you hear that?" Sarah whispered, her eyes wide with fear. I nodded, my throat too tight to speak. We followed the sound to the living room window. Outside, the street was empty, the night still. But the crying continued, growing louder and more anguished. And then we saw her. She was standing at the edge of the street, her white gown billowing in an unseen wind. Her head was tilted downward, her dark hair obscuring her face. Slowly, she raised her head, and I felt my blood turn to ice. Her face was no longer blurred, it was twisted and grotesque, her mouth stretched wide in a silent scream. She raised a hand and pointed directly at us. Sarah screamed, pulling me back from the window. When I looked again, she was gone. From that night on, the activity escalated. Doors slammed shut on their own, lights flickered, and objects moved as if unseen hands were rearranging my life. The crying grew more persistent, sometimes accompanied by whispers in Spanish that I couldn't understand. I tried everything to rid myself of her presence. I spoke to priests, shamans, even skeptics who suggested it was all in my head. Nothing worked. If anything, the attempts seemed to anger her. One night, I woke to the sound of splashing water. My bedroom floor was soaked, as if a river had flowed through it. Standing at the foot of my bed was La Llorona, her skeletal hand reaching out for me. "You took them!" she screamed, her voice like the wailing of 1,000 souls. I bolted upright, my heart pounding as I realized I was alone. The water was gone, but the fear lingered. Desperate for answers, I began researching La Llorona's legend, hoping to find some clue that could explain why she had targeted me. The stories were all the same. A grieving mother, driven to madness after drowning her children, cursed to wander the earth in search of them. But one detail stood out. Her victims were often those who disturbed her sacred spaces. The river. That cursed river. I reached out to a local historian who specialized in folklore. When I told him about the river where we had camped, his face darkened. "Many people avoid that area," he said. "There have been sightings of her there for decades. Some say it's where she drowned her children. Others believe it's simply where her spirit lingers." "Is there any way to stop her?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He shook his head. "You can't stop her, but you might be able to appease her." Following his advice, I returned to the river with an offering. flowers, a candle, and a prayer of apology. I was terrified to go back, but I had no choice. The crying was driving me to the brink of insanity, and I knew she wouldn't stop until she got what she wanted. As I knelt by the riverbank, the air grew cold. The candle flickered, and I felt her presence before I saw her. She emerged from the water, her gown dripping and her eyes glowing with an unearthly light. For a moment she simply stared at me, her expression unreadable. "I'm sorry," I whispered, tears streaming down my face. "I didn't mean to disturb you." She tilted her head, her gaze softening ever so slightly. Then, without a word, she turned and disappeared into the water. The crying stopped after that night, but the fear remained. I still feel her presence sometimes, in the shadows and the silence. I don't know if she's truly gone or if she's simply watching, waiting. But one thing is certain. La Llorona's curse is real, and it's something I'll carry with me forever. After my terrifying confrontation at the river, I thought it was over. The crying had stopped, and for a brief moment, I allowed myself to believe that the nightmare had ended. But as anyone who's ever been touched by La Llorona's curse will tell you, it's never that simple. I had done everything I could to appease her, but deep down, I knew the connection wasn't severed. The curse lingered like a faint stain on my soul, a haunting that refused to fade completely. And soon I realized the worst was yet to come. Weeks passed and life began to return to normal, or at least what I hoped was normal. I went back to work, reconnected with friends, and tried to push the events out of my mind. But La Llorona wouldn't let me forget. It started subtly at first, faint whispers in the dead of night, shadows that seemed to move when no one else was around. Then came the crying. I was in the shower one evening, the water steaming up the small bathroom, when I heard it again. Faint at first, barely audible over the sound of running water. But it grew louder and louder until it was all I could hear. I froze, my heart pounding as the wailing seemed to surround me, echoing off the tiled walls. I threw open the shower curtain, half expecting to see her standing there, but the bathroom was empty. "Leave me alone," I screamed, my voice trembling with desperation. The crying stopped abruptly, leaving an eerie silence in its place. I stood there, dripping and shaking, realizing that the curse hadn't been lifted, it had only been lying dormant. Desperate for answers, I confided in my grandmother. She had always been the keeper of our family's history, and if anyone could shed light on what was happening, it was her. When I told her about La Llorona, her face paled and she crossed herself. "She has followed our family before," she whispered, her voice thick with fear. "What do you mean?" I asked, my heart sinking. She hesitated, then told me a story I'd never heard before. Decades ago, my great-grandmother had encountered La Llorona near a river in Mexico. She had been with her children, including my grandmother, and had seen the spirit standing on the opposite bank, crying out for her lost children. "She reached for us," my grandmother said, her voice trembling. "But my mother pulled us away and ran. We thought we had escaped, but strange things started happening after that. The crying, the shadows, the feeling of being watched. It only stopped when my mother went back to the river and made an offering. I realized then that this wasn't just about me. It was something deeper, something tied to my family's history. La Llorona wasn't just haunting me, she was haunting us. I knew what I had to do. If La Llorona's curse had returned to my family, I had to end it once and for all. I couldn't live like this, and I couldn't let her terrorize the next generation. Armed with advice from my grandmother, I returned to the river for the final time. This time, I didn't go alone. Sarah insisted on coming with me, even though she was just as terrified as I was. We brought flowers, candles, and a small wooden cross. My grandmother had instructed me to offer these items with a prayer of forgiveness, asking La Llorona to release her hold on us. As we approached the riverbank, the air grew colder, and an unnatural stillness settled over the area. The water seemed darker than before, its surface like polished obsidian. "She's here," Sarah whispered, clutching my arm. We knelt by the river and lit the candles. I placed the flowers in the water, letting them drift downstream, and recited the prayer my grandmother had taught me. "Please forgive us," I whispered, my voice shaking. "We meant no harm. Release us from your pain." For a moment, nothing happened. The air was silent, heavy with anticipation. Then the water began to ripple, and she appeared. La Llorona rose from the river, her white gown glowing in the moonlight. Her face was no longer twisted and grotesque, but filled with sorrow. She looked at me with eyes that seemed to pierce my very soul. "You cannot undo what has been done," she said, her voice like the wind. "But you have shown me respect. For that I will leave you." She raised her hand, and for a moment I felt an overwhelming sense of peace. Then she disappeared, her form dissolving into the mist. The crying stopped that night, and the shadows lifted. For the first time in months, I felt a sense of relief. Sarah and I left the river in silence, too shaken to speak but grateful that it was over. Since then, my life has returned to normal, or as normal as it can be after experiencing something so otherworldly. I still think about her sometimes, about the pain that drove her to such extremes. I don't know if she has truly found peace, but I hope she has. One thing is certain, the curse of La Llorona is real. I lived it, and I'll carry the memory of it with me for the rest of my life. If you ever hear her crying, remember my story. Show her respect, and never ever take her presence lightly. Thank you for listening to my story. If you want to hear more scary stories, please like and subscribe to my channel.